Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Craig VanSandt. I'll be moderating today's show. I teach at the University of Northern Iowa and hold the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics there. As many of you are probably well aware, there is a growing concern in the United States about income and wealth disparities. On this morning's show, we'd like to explore some of the causes of that inequality and look at some of the major effects, both at the individual and social levels. But before we get started doing that, I would like to introduce our panelists this morning. First, we have Ben Rogers, Lynn County Supervisor. Ben, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. We also have Denine Rushing, the shelter manager at the Willis Dady shelter in Cedar Rapids. Denine, we really appreciate you being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, we have John Solow, a professor of economics at the University of Iowa. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back.
In a recent article in the New York Times, the 2006 Nobel Peace Prize winner, Muhammad Yunus, he quoted an Oxfam report saying that 8 people, and let me emphasize that, 8 people own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the world's population. So that's 8 people versus some 3.6 or 7 billion people, billion with a B. And in more recent reports, those 8 people have been said to decrease to about 5. So there's an incredible disparity in wealth. And the disparity in annual income is just as startling. Although we expect some people to do better in a capitalistic economy, there are many people who study this issue that are getting very concerned with the degree of inequality that we see in the United States. And to learn more about this situation, I want to first turn to our economist, John Solow. John, I mentioned both disparities in income and wealth. Just so we're on the same page with definitions, can you talk about those?
Sure, and you hear both of these inequalities mentioned, and they're not the same thing, although they are correlated. Income is what a person or a household, or for that matter, a country or a community, but we'll talk about households largely, what a household makes in a given year. So it's what you take in over the course of a year. That's income from labor, from capital, from government transfer programs, perhaps bequests, whatever its source. Wealth is your net worth. Wealth is it's the sum total of the value of your assets minus the value of your debts. And those are two different things. And while as I said, they're often correlated. People with high wealth tend to have high incomes, and people with high incomes tend to have high wealth. They need not be the same thing.
Okay, so I may make lots and lots of money, but blow it all on something and
think of a
accumulate.
well-paid lawyer with a serious cocaine problem. That person may have a very high income, but very little saved up, very little wealth. Likewise, you could think of somebody with a retired person with a mattress full of money. That person has a lot of wealth, but perhaps no income. They aren't bringing anything in over the course of the year.
Sure. Well, I'm going to stick with you for just a second as the economist. Give us some idea of what we're seeing with income and wealth disparity.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I do have some notes because there's a lot of figures to keep track of, and I won't give you all of them. But For those who haven't thought about the issue before, the way we like to think about this is, first of all, this is a little bit more complicated question than you might think, mainly due to questions about how you measure things. So I mentioned household income, family income, individual income. Those can be different, right? A household might consist of one 22-year-old person living on their own. It could be the traditional family with a couple of parents and some children. It could be an individual. So it matters which you use, right? I'm going to talk mainly about households because if we think about people, there are a lot of very young people, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds who obviously don't make any money, and many of them don't have any wealth either, but we really don't think of them as poor. It depends on who they're living with. So if you think about households, the idea is you think about lining up all the households in America from the very poorest to the Bezos family, lining them up all in a line, and then going up the line and counting off, say, the poorest 20%, the next poorest 20%, all the way up to the richest 20%, and within that we might think about the richest 1%, that's the famous 1%, or even fractions of percent. So if we're talking about income, the cutoff, the middle of that line, that's what we call the median income, where half of the people earn less, half of the households earn less, half of the households earn more. In 2015 was roughly $57,000. So for a household, and it might be, again, it might be a one-person household, it might be a 6-person household or a 10-person household. The middle of that line is roughly $56,000, $57,000. To be in the richest 20%, that you have to be, the household has to earn $112,000. Again, roughly, I'm rounding a little bit. That's not what we think of as fabulously wealthy, making 100. Again, it could be a couple each making $50,000 a year. That's not badly off, but it's not what we think of as fabulously rich. To be in the top 1%, to be in the top 5%, you have to be making, as a household, about $215,000 a year. Now, if we talk about wealth, that's a little different. The cutoff for, say, the 60th percentile, households earning in the bottom 60% have a net worth of roughly $170,000, and that's often the house makes up most of their assets. The top end, to be in the top 5%, and this is 2016 data, to be in the top 5%, you need to have a net worth of somewhere around $2.4 million. So there's a great deal of disparity there. By the way, with regards to wealth, at the bottom end, the poorest households actually tend to have negative net worth. They owe more than the assets that they own.
Sure. I wish our screen behind us was a display screen, because much of this is made easier if you look at graphs. And Ben, I'm going to do something incredibly rude. I'm going to put my hands in front of your face. But you looking at it from the audience, if time is moving this direction, most of the bottom part of the economic status has stayed pretty flat for the last 30 or 40 years, whereas the upper levels just are going straight up. And so we see that increasing wealth disparity. I really do apologize for doing it that way. But John's given us several statistics to think about in terms of this income disparity. Do you see that at the local level as well? I mean, we're talking about federal statistics. Do you see that here in Lynn County?
Oh, certainly we do. And county government is designed to be the layer of government that actually provides the human and social services for people on the low end of what we're talking about. And in Lynn County, there's several groups of people I'd like to talk about. One is called asset limited, income constrained employed, meaning ALICE. Those are people who make above federal poverty, who are employed but do not make enough to meet basic needs or necessities within a household budget, as well as those living in poverty. Those two groups together are about 25% of the households here in Lynn County. And we are seeing more and more people who are employed, who aren't able to meet their basic needs, or if they were to get off public assistance, they're not able to make enough to fill in those gaps of the subsidies that they're receiving. So our Veteran Affairs Department, Public Health, Mental Health, General Assistance, Child and Youth Development, all are services that are helping service those folks at the low end of low wages, and that's one of the impetuses for Lynn County, being the second county in Iowa to raise the local minimum wage, but then the state took that authority away because of this income inequality. By raising the minimum wage, you're not going to make anyone rich, but certainly it's a pathway to begin to be able to maybe even start to have a little bit of a savings account.
Sure.
If you're on the low end of low wages, every dollar in is a dollar out, and you're not able to participate in the what many call the American dream. And we're starting to see more and more people into those two different groups that I just mentioned.
Thank you. Denine, I've not gotten to you yet, but I want to ask you probably the most important question that I'll ask tonight, and that is, how do you see this playing out in people low income that are often in your facility?
Well, I also have some statistics, Craig.
Oh,
so
great.
That's what
Great.
my notes are. So in 2015, out of 295 adults in our shelter, 130 reported having some form of disability, and many of them were still working, not able to make ends meet. 48 of them reported some type of physical disability, 35 reported having a substance abuse problem, 40 reported being a victim of domestic violence. With income inequality on an individual level, it may be the result of some individuals battling these barriers, or these barriers going unaddressed. 74 of the 295 adults suffered from some form of mental illness. Also in 2015, 2 mental health facilities were closed, one in Mount Pleasant and one in Clarinda. We now only have 2 longer care mental health facilities, one in Cherokee, Iowa, and one in Independence, Iowa. Now it is suggested that we have 50 beds available for mental health for every 100,000 individuals. We currently only have 2 beds available for every 100,000 individuals. If we can get individuals in our community the proper care to address these mental health issues, these substance abuse issues, can they then go out into the workplace, make a livable wage where they're able to support their families? Possibly. What we need to have is services set in place for individuals who have barriers, and for them to be able to address those barriers so that they can be as successful as possible. For example, let's say we have a client named Tommy. Tommy can address his bipolar, get on the right meds so he can stop medicating. If he's able to get into a program to learn a trade where he can make more than $7.25 an hour, then Tommy may be able to successfully provide for his family. What we also need to understand is if we can get the heads of the family able to be out in the workforce where they're able to make a livable wage, we may also be able to conquer some of the other issues that we see going on in our community. So if Tommy is able to successfully provide for his family, and his family can see that he's working in a positive environment and he's providing a home for his family, maybe his daughter won't end up on drugs. Maybe his young son that may have had trouble in the past will now graduate from high school and go on to college. What we need to do is stop the cycle, one individual or one family at a time. And we can do that, I believe, by raising minimum wage. I think it has a lot to do with it. I mean, honestly, if you're making $7.25 an hour, let's say you're a single dad with 2 kids, how are you going to even be able to pay your rent? If you have a 2-bedroom apartment, rent is usually about $600 to $650 a month. When you add on child care, transportation, food, healthcare. There's no way that you'd be able to provide all of those things making such a small amount. It is suggested that if you're a single adult with 2 children, that you should be making over $21 an hour. And I'm not saying that we're going to be able to do that, but I'm just saying more than $7.25. People are
Sure.
not surviving off of this.
Well, what I'm hearing from, I think, all 3 of you is that this is a systemic issue. It isn't lack of effort, like we might stigmatize people. There are mental health issues and those kinds of things that you bring up that we're not doing well at treating systematically. I want to get back to the idea of the actual spreading of wealth. And John, let me come back to you on this. I know I'm going to butcher the French name. Thomas Piketty,
I pronounce it Piketty.
an economist from France, wrote a book recently about capital in the 21st century. Can you, I know this is like a 600-page book.
It is.
Can you summarize its argument?
It is, and I've read it, all 568 pages. Maybe one of the few people who've actually read the thing from cover to cover. So I want to start out with something that you said a little bit earlier, which is that this seems to be a perennial thing, and it hasn't always been a perennial thing. It has ebbed and flowed, and that's a big part of Piketty's story. What he does, and the book mainly is sort of a very careful tracing out of historical data from the United States, but also England and France, and to some extent Sweden and Germany, and but mainly European countries and the United States, is to trace out this inequality in labor income and capital income and so forth from roughly the late 1800s or the turn of the 20th century to today. And the picture, it's a 550-page book, and there's a lot in there, but the overall picture that he paints is that in the 1920s, say, there was this great inequality of wealth. Not just in the United States, but in fact, if anything, even more so in Europe. And it was really the landed aristocracy, right? It was the counts and the barons who owned a lot of land and so forth. Then from the 1920s to about the 1960s, actually things got a lot more equal. And the very large, the very wealthy families lost a lot. A lot of that happened during World War II, and these big estates were broken up. But then, since the 1980s, and particularly since the turn of the 21st century, the inequality of wealth has begun to rise, and we are getting back. And again, it's not just an American phenomenon; it's also a phenomenon in Europe. We're getting back to the levels that we had back at the turn of the century. We are approaching levels of inequality where we really have sort of an aristocracy, an oligarchy, if you will. Things have changed a little bit. So the other thing that he focuses very much on, I think it's a very important part of the story, is capital income, is the ownership of assets. So the very wealthy people, the 1% and the 10th of 1%, actually generally don't earn their money from labor income. It's not their wages that make them wealthy. It's the fact that they own companies and vast portfolios of stocks and bonds and other sorts of financial assets. And it's the income from that has really become much more unequal. And that's real, and that is the wealth, right? The ownership of things is the wealth. And Piketty's main story is that wealth is generating income faster than people can spend it, basically. And so then the people who own it can spend it, and so it accumulates, and eventually we see this rise of the new oligarchs, I guess, if you want to use. He doesn't use that word, but I'll throw it out there.
Sure. Well, as I understand it, the way that the rich, the wealthy that you're talking about, earn the money is through their ownership of stocks, which working people don't have.
Right.
So we have a built-in discrepancy in the system. I don't know that we're at a point yet where we can start talking about solutions, but I'm curious. Do any of you have ideas about how we might attack this problem?
Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. There are three main theories about why this is happening. One is technology, that increasingly the sorts of jobs that need doing involve skills and education, and sort of the technically literate and highly educated are doing better and better, and people who lack those skills. And there the answer is education. A second theory is that it's globalization, that increasingly the jobs that used to be done by the high school educated people, sort of blue collar working folks, those jobs are now being done by people in other countries, and people who are willing to work for a lot less because they're a lot poorer. And there, if you believe that, the answer may have something to do with international trade, although most economists are not very excited about interfering with international trade. The third hypothesis or theory, and by the way, all of these may be true, is that it has something to do with our institutions, that the rules are changing to favor the wealthy. They influence politics. They vote themselves tax breaks and various other ways to shelter income and hide income from taxation, and generally just favor themselves over other people. And there, I think, the solution is political. And all three of those things are probably true to some degree.
Sure. Denine, you mentioned raising the minimum wage from $7.25 to whatever it should be. How do you see advocating for that? You are in constant contact with people making minimum wage. Do they have a voice to demand that?
That is a very good point that you just made. I do agree with you. I think that politics has a lot to do with the direction that things are going as far as income and inequality. I feel that everyone in the community does have a voice, even our clients. Even if you're living in a shelter, you still have a voice. And in order for your voice to be heard, you do have to get out there and you have to vote, because your vote, every vote makes a difference. And so within the community, we have to work together in, motivating our neighbors, motivating them to get out there and do the best that they can. Minimum wage does need to be raised. It's a serious issue. And if we can get our neighbor out there to vote, maybe that can it can definitely make a difference. And so advocating for our clients is definitely something that we do, and we also strongly suggest that they advocate for themselves, because at the shelter we have several case managers, and they definitely advocate for our clients on a daily basis. But we also want to self-empower them by motivating them to advocate for themselves as well. We actually have a group that our case manager and our volunteer coordinator heads. I believe it's twice a month, and the whole purpose of this particular meeting that they have with our group of clients is to self-empower them, give them a platform where their voice can be heard. And sometimes we do talk about politics and getting out there and vote and the difference that will make.
And Ben, as an elected official, how would you recommend that citizens address this issue?
Well, I think that there needs to be both a local, state, and national push in addressing income inequality. No one county board can do it on their own. No one state legislature can do it on their own. It really needs to be a movement of people that are really wanting to address this issue. You know, in researching and thinking about this topic, the one thing about American capitalism that is such an amazing economic force is that you can be someone with a few dollars in your pocket and make it of yourself. But the same system also keeps people with only a few dollars in their pocket. We incentivize people or we create disincentives from ever getting out of the lower economic strata. For instance, a woman I met with recently said that if she were to get a raise, that would push her above the threshold where she and her children would get certain subsidies. And she actually told her boss, please do not give me this raise because it'll cost me more than I'll get per hour based on this raise. We are keeping people in poverty. And because the leap from making $14 an hour to maybe $25 an hour where they're able to afford those cannot be done in just a single leap. And so we need to really address the disparities at the low end and figure out ways politically that we can also address issues at the fraction of a percent at the very, very top, and how to at least slow it down so it doesn't become a cyclical again, where maybe like in the time periods that you suggested that you had very rich families or very few elites, and then they lost a lot of their dollars. So it doesn't become cyclical, and we keep going through this every few generations. So it really is a call to action on all levels of government.
Thank you. We are running out of time. What I'd like to do is ask each of you, what does the viewers need to know that we haven't discussed about income inequality? Any ideas?
Well, I'll toss out one thing with a policy that there's a lot of conversation about, but we don't know a lot about, and that's what's sometimes called a universal basic income. The idea is that every man, woman, child would be entitled to a sum of money, a reasonably large sum of money, it depends on the order of, say, $10,000 a year. And that would, including the very rich and the poor. But of course, to the poor, $10,000 is a lot of money, and that matters. To a very rich person, it wouldn't matter so much. And then fund that by taxing on a fairly progressive basis. That is, taxing the wealthy more than the poor. There are debates about whether this should supplant or replace current sets of policies. But the idea is that, a family of four, with each person entitled to $10,000 a year, that's getting close to our median income, which was about $50,000.
John, I'm going to have to cut you off. We're getting short. Denine, any last words?
Well, I guess my last words would just be that for individuals in the community that are living below the poverty line, that you just have to keep striving. You have to keep pushing. Definitely never give up.
Okay. And Ben?
I would just say that you're not the sum of what you make, that really people are so much more.
Thank you. On behalf of the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, I'd like to thank all of our panelists this morning, and I'd like to thank you, the viewers. Have a great week.